Thomas Jefferson knew something about banks that we've completely forgotten. In 1791, when Alexander Hamilton proposed America's first central bank, Jefferson's warning was crystal clear. Banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Think about that. The man who wrote the Declaration of Independence feared banks more than military invasion. You see, Jefferson understood something we've forgotten. He'd lived under the British banking system. He'd watched how the Bank of England manipulated currency, funded wars, and concentrated wealth among a privileged few. He knew exactly what Hamilton was proposing and why it terrified him. Here's what should grab our attention. Jefferson wasn't worried about armies or foreign invasion. He feared banks. Specifically, he feared what he called banking institutions that could create money and control our currency. In his own words, these institutions would become more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Think about that for a moment. The man who wrote the Declaration of Independence believed banks posed a greater threat to American freedom than military occupation. Hamilton's proposal seemed reasonable enough on the surface. Create a central bank to stabilize our currency, manage government debt, and provide credit for economic growth. It would be modeled after the Bank of England, the same institution that had helped fund Britain's empire and its war against us. But Jefferson saw through the financial jargon to the raw power underneath. This wasn't just about banking. It was about who controls the money supply, who decides how much currency exists, who gets access to credit and who doesn't, who profits when the government needs to borrow. Jefferson understood that whoever controls the money controls the country, period. Madison joined Jefferson in fierce opposition. They argued the Constitution gave Congress no authority to charter a national bank. More importantly, they warned it would corrupt our republic from within. Private banks would profit from public authority. Wealthy financiers would manipulate currency for their own benefit. The concentration of financial power would destroy the very equality our revolution had fought to establish. Their arguments were passionate and prescient. Jefferson warned that banking institutions with monetary control would deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Washington faced an impossible choice. His Treasury Secretary promised financial stability and economic growth. His Secretary of State warned of financial tyranny and democratic destruction. In February 1791, Washington made his decision. He signed Hamilton's bank bill into law. The first bank of the United States was born with a 20-year charter, $10 million in capital, and unprecedented power over American currency. Private shareholders owned 80% of the bank, yet it held all government deposits and issued the nation's currency. Jefferson's nightmare had begun. A private institution now controlled America's money supply, earned profits from public authority, and operated largely beyond democratic oversight. But here's what Jefferson knew that we've forgotten. This was just the beginning. Once you give private banks the power to create money and control currency, they'll never willingly give it back. Every crisis becomes an opportunity to expand their authority. Every economic emergency justifies more centralized control. The pattern Jefferson feared in 1791 would repeat again and again throughout American history. Each time the public tried to destroy the central bank, it would return stronger, more powerful, and more deeply embedded in our financial system. What Jefferson witnessed in that cabinet room wasn't just a policy debate. It was the first battle in a war between democratic money and private banking that continues today. The Founding Fathers had fought a revolution to escape centralized control. Now they were about to recreate it voluntarily, with American characteristics. Jefferson lost that first battle, but his warning echoes across centuries. The issuing power of currency shall be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. We ignored his warning then. We're still ignoring it now, but the consequences he predicted keep materializing around us, one financial crisis at a time. Here's where Jefferson's prediction gets eerily accurate. He warned that once you give banks control over money, they'll never voluntarily surrender that power. Instead, they'll use every crisis to come back stronger. American history proves him right with mathematical precision. The first bank died exactly as scheduled in 1811, when its 20-year charter expired. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans had gained control of Congress and refused to renew it. Victory for the people, right? Wrong. 1 year later, the War of 1812 created financial chaos. Government couldn't fund the military. Currency collapsed. Regional banks issued worthless notes. The economy imploded. Suddenly, Hamilton's banking solution didn't look so dangerous anymore. In 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States with even more power than the first. 20 million in capital instead of 10 million, more government deposits, greater currency control. Jefferson's nightmare had returned stronger than before. The Second Bank dominated American finance for 20 years until Andrew Jackson declared war on it. Old Hickory understood exactly what Jefferson had warned about. He called the bank a hydra of corruption that concentrated wealth among Eastern elites while ordinary Americans paid the price. Jackson's 1832 veto message was brutal. The rich and powerful too often bend the axe of government to their selfish purposes. He accused the bank of buying political influence, manipulating currency for private gain, and threatening democratic equality. The bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, fought back by deliberately creating a financial crisis. He restricted credit, called in loans, and crashed the economy to prove America needed the bank. Biddle openly admitted his strategy. Nothing but the evidence of suffering will produce any effect in Congress. Jackson's response was pure American defiance. The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it. In 1836, Jackson succeeded. The Second Bank's charter expired, and this time it wasn't renewed. For 77 years, from 1836 to 1913, America operated without a central bank. And you know what happened? We functioned just fine. Actually, better than fine. Those 77 years included massive westward expansion, the Transcontinental Railroad, Industrial Revolution, and emergence as a global economic power. But Jefferson's pattern wasn't finished repeating. The 1907 banking panic created the perfect crisis. Banks collapsed across the country. J.P. Morgan had to personally organize a bailout to prevent total financial collapse. The message was clear. America needed a central bank to prevent such chaos. What happened next proves Jefferson understood bankers better than anyone. In November 1910, 7 of the world's most powerful financiers secretly met at Jekyll Island, Georgia. J.P. Morgan's partner, the head of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, representatives from the Rockefellers and Rothschilds, Paul Warburg, who'd studied European central banking for decades. They spent 9 days crafting legislation to create America's third central bank. But this time, they learned from history. No 20-year charter that could expire. No obvious name like Bank of the United States that screamed centralized power. Instead, they called it the Federal Reserve System. Sounds government-controlled, doesn't it? It's not. Regional banks make it seem decentralized. They're not. Reserve suggests it just holds money. It creates money. The marketing was brilliant. The substance was exactly what Jefferson feared. On December 23, 1913, while most of Congress had left for Christmas break, the Federal Reserve Act passed with minimal debate. President Wilson signed it immediately. The pattern Jefferson predicted had completed its final cycle. Crisis created opportunity. Private banking interests designed the solution. Public opposition was minimized through deception and timing. The central bank returned with permanent power and clever disguises. But here's the crucial difference. This time, there's no expiration date. The Federal Reserve isn't chartered for 20 years like its predecessors. It's permanent, self-governing, largely beyond democratic control. Jefferson's warning about banking institutions becoming more dangerous than standing armies was about to be tested on a scale he never imagined. The question isn't whether his prediction came true. The question is whether we'll ever learn from the pattern he identified over 2 centuries ago. Let me show you exactly how Jefferson's worst fears have materialized in ways he couldn't have imagined. In 1791, Jefferson warned that banking institutions would concentrate wealth and corrupt our republic. He predicted they'd manipulate currency, operate beyond democratic control, and privatize profits while socializing losses. Every single prediction has come true, and worse. Start with the 2008 financial crisis. While millions of Americans lost their homes, the Federal Reserve secretly lent $7.7 trillion to the same banks that caused the disaster. Not millions, trillions. That's more money than our entire federal budget. Think about the injustice Jefferson would have seen. Banks gamble with risky mortgages, crash the economy, then get rewarded with the largest bailout in human history. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans who played by the rules lose everything. This is exactly what Jefferson meant by privatize profits, socialize losses. Banks keep the gains when times are good. Taxpayers absorb the losses when banks fail. But the money printing makes Jefferson's currency warnings look prophetic. From 2008 to 2020, the Federal Reserve created over $7 trillion from absolutely nothing. No gold backing, no congressional approval, no democratic oversight. 7 unelected officials simply decided to create more money than existed in the entire previous century. The Fed's balance sheet exploded from $860 billion in 2008 to $7.4 trillion by 2025. That's not economic growth, that's currency debasement on an unprecedented scale. Jefferson predicted this exact scenario. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Look around. How's that prediction working out? Since the Federal Reserve's creation in 1913, the dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power. What cost $1 in 1913 costs over $30 today. That's not inflation, that's systematic currency destruction, exactly as Jefferson warned. The 2021 to 2022 inflation surge proved his point in real time. Official inflation hit 9%, but real prices jumped 20 to 40% on essentials like food, gas, and housing. Millions of Americans watched their purchasing power evaporate while the Fed insisted everything was under control. Jefferson warned that more currency always leads to higher prices. The Fed created trillions of new dollars, then acted surprised when prices exploded. This isn't economic mystery. It's basic cause and effect that Jefferson understood 230 years ago. But here's what should terrify every American. The powers the Federal Reserve wields today make Jefferson's worst nightmares look quaint. 7 unelected officials set interest rates that affect every mortgage, credit card, and business loan in America. They decide which banks get bailouts and which ones fail. They regulate the entire financial system while being owned by the banks they're supposed to oversee. The president can't fire the Fed chairman. Congress can't override Fed decisions. Courts rarely challenge Fed authority. This institution operates with more independence than any government agency. Yet, it's not really part of our government. The regional Federal Reserve banks are actually owned by commercial banks that earn guaranteed 6% dividends on their Fed stock. Private banks literally profit from public monetary policy. Jefferson would have recognized this immediately as exactly the corruption he feared. Our national debt has exploded to $36 trillion largely because the Fed enables unlimited government borrowing by creating money to buy treasury bonds. Jefferson warned that banking institutions would corrupt politics through easy credit for politicians. Today, politicians spend recklessly because they know the Fed will monetize the debt. Wealth inequality has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age. The richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. This isn't accidental. It's the predictable result of monetary policy that inflates asset prices while devaluing wages and savings. Jefferson understood that whoever controls the money supply controls society. The Federal Reserve has become the most powerful unelected institution in America, with more influence over our daily lives than Congress, the Supreme Court, or the President. Every economic crisis strengthens the Fed's authority. Every financial emergency justifies more intervention. Every market crash demands more money printing. The pattern Jefferson identified in 1791 continues accelerating. Crisis, expansion of banking power, public acceptance, repeat. We've built exactly the system Jefferson warned would destroy our republic. We called it progress. We called it stability. We called it necessary. Jefferson called it tyranny. The Federal Reserve today wields every power Jefferson feared a central bank would claim. It creates money from nothing, answers to no one, and socializes losses while privatizing gains. It operates beyond democratic control, yet determines the value of every dollar we earn and spend. The nightmare Jefferson described 234 years ago isn't coming. It's here. The only question is whether we'll ever listen to the warning we've ignored for over 2 centuries. Thomas Jefferson knew something about banks that we've forgotten. They're more dangerous to our liberty than any foreign army because they attack our freedom from within, using our own currency as their weapon. His warning echoes across history, waiting for Americans brave enough to remember what we've lost and bold enough to reclaim it.